You can. I will also mute them for you.
Okay, if you need be. All right, that's fine. So you got to watch for maybe turning it on if you have to.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this all-party critics debate on foreign policy. Why foreign policy matters to Canadians and how their perspective strengthens Canada's place in the world. My name is Elizabeth Kingston, and I'm the president of the National Capital Branch of the Canadian International Council and the host of today's debate. We are delighted to have with us today Rob Oliphant, the Honorable Michael Chong, Stéphane Bergeron, Jack Harris, and our moderator, John Ibbitson. Je vous remercie tous de votre présence parmi nous. Brièvement, les intérêts du Canada se trouvent plus que jamais mis à l'épreuve. La sécurité des Canadiens, la prospérité dont nous jouissons et la santé publique et la santé de nos communautés sont intrinsèques à ce qui se passe en dehors et à l'intérieur de nos frontières. Our distinguished parliamentarians will present their perspectives, debate amongst themselves, and have questions posed by participants, all through the able moderation of Mr. Ibbitson. Mr. Oliphant is a Liberal member representing Don Valley West, elected in 2015, then in 2019. He is currently serving as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. An ordained minister in the United Church of Canada, he was the senior minister at Eglinton St. George United Church and actively engaged in social and economic justice issues. The Honorable Michael Chong, Conservative member for Wellington Halton Hills, is the shadow minister for foreign affairs for the official opposition. First elected in 2004, he served in 2006 as president of the Queen's Privy Council, Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Minister for Sport. In 2015, Mr. Chong's efforts led to the passage of the Reform Act, giving MPs more power to represent their constituents and Canadians. Monsieur Bergeron, député de Montarville, représente le Bloc québécois. Il a été élu pour la première fois en 1993 et encore en 1997, 2000 et 2004. Il est porte-parole du Bloc québécois en matière des affaires étrangères, ainsi que porte-parole en matière des affaires intergouvernementales. En 2005, il a été élu député de Verchères à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec et pendant plusieurs années occupé des postes tels que le whip en chef de leader parlementaire adjoint de l'opposition officielle, ainsi que le porte-parole du Parti québécois en relations internationales. Mr. Harris is the NDP member for St. John's East. First elected in 1987, he was then elected in 1990 as a member of the Newfoundland and Labrador House of Assembly, where he served for 16 years. He then returned to Ottawa in 2019 and is a foreign affairs critic, as well as critic for public safety and emergency preparedness and the Atlantic Opportunities Agency. He also serves as vice chair of the Common Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. John Ibbitson is a writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail and one of Canada's best-known and respected journalists and authors. He has served with the Globe as Washington Bureau Chief, Ottawa Bureau Chief, and since 2015 has been the author of numerous books, including The Big Shift and Stephen Harper, the award-winning biography of Canada's 22nd Prime Minister. I welcome you all. You will have 2 minutes for your opening remarks. Mr. Ibbitson will then pose each of you a question for you to respond to within 2 minutes, followed then by questions posed by participants. Following the question and answer period, you will each have 2 minutes for your closing remarks. For those wanting to ask questions, please write them in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screens. Mr. Ibbitson will then do his best to pose as many questions as possible given the time constraints. Thank you all for your kind participation and your support of the work of the CIC. Merci à vous tous et à John, c'est à vous.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to moderate today's discussion on the future of Canadian foreign policy. We live in interesting times. The world's borders are closed due to a global pandemic. The United States has just emerged from 4 years of a nativist populist president. China is increasingly aggressive, Russia increasingly assertive. India is rising as a new superpower, even as Europe questions its future. And Latin America and Africa continue to struggle for stability and prosperity. How is Canada to make its way in this 21st century future world? Our 4 MPs will each discuss and explain their party's positions on these questions in the strict 2-minute time period they have been allocated. I will then ask a question of each of them myself, and then we will open the floor to questions from viewers. Our goal here is to enrich the discussion of the future of Canada in the world. Mr. Oliphant, we'll begin with you. 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity. And I'm very much looking forward to further conversation about the foreign policy by Canadians review that the CIC has undertaken. And these are indeed, as you have said, John, interesting times. They're challenging times, and they're difficult times. COVID-19 has shown us that our fate as Canadians and as a country, Canada, is deeply intertwined with the community of nations. COVID-19 is causing loss and uncertainty across the globe, and governments have scrambled to protect their own citizens from the virus and its economic repercussions. Meanwhile, the pandemic is exacerbating existing tensions. Some regimes have used it as an excuse to limit human rights, media freedoms, adding pressure on the international system and vital multilateral institutions that strive to ensure peace and prosperity around the world. If we add the ongoing threat of climate change, we can only conclude that to be safe, we need to advance together. And we can leave no country behind on any of those issues. So in Canada, we are committed, this government is committed to both strong bilateral ties with important partners around the world, as well as a complete commitment to multilateralism and working with other countries, always in the international rules-based order. It's not just the pandemic, but the pandemic has heightened the importance of it. We welcome, obviously, President Biden's recommitment to establishing diplomacy at the center of their foreign policy, and very pleased with the outcomes of the meetings that he had with the Prime Minister, as well as Secretary Blinken had with the Foreign Minister, Marc Garneau, just last week. We are strengthening together to look at the world, both from a bilateral perspective, but also their commitment to multilateralism is encouraging. We look to other states as well, whether it's India, whether it's various countries of the EU or the UK, whether it's working with small island states collectively or individually, or African nations to ensure that no one is left behind. We are committed to ensuring that we find a way to move ahead on issues of international rules-based order, multilateralism, and human rights agenda, as well as our feminist foreign policy. Multilateralism will be the key to ensuring global stability, especially when you deal with things like China being a dominant force. We cannot go it alone. And so we work with other like-minded countries to defend the rules-based international order and to ensure that China abides by its obligations under international human rights law. I will just close by saying our last commitment will be for Canadians abroad, and that's why we are attempting to strengthen measures against arbitrary detention, which have been highlighted by Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig detention. We are committed to making sure that no state uses Canadians or any other people of other nationalities as weapons in their activities. Thank you very much.
I apologize, Mr. Chung.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for hosting this today, and thank you, Elizabeth, for organizing it. And thank you to the CIC for all the work that you do in foreign policy. I'll just start by saying and acknowledging that the government has had some foreign policy accomplishments. They negotiated a new USMCA under pretty difficult circumstances with an administration that was unlike any other we've seen in recent decades. They concluded a trade agreement with the European Union, and they concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all things which are good for advancing Canada's economic interests. The government has continued with Operation Reassurance in Eastern Europe, which is Canada's largest military mission abroad and shows and demonstrates Canada's commitment to the NATO alliance. And they've continued with Operation Unifier in Ukraine, both important missions in an area of the world that is under threat from increasing authoritarianism. But I think in general, the government's foreign policy has been a disappointment. We've had 4 ministers of foreign affairs in 5 years. The government came to office promising to do much better on climate change, and yet Canada's emissions continue to rise. 729 megatons for 2018, the most recent year for which we have data. On overseas development assistance, the government has cut ODA by 10% coming to office. ODA under the previous government averaged 0.3% of gross national income. ODA under the current government has averaged 0.27% of GNI, a 10% cut. The government came to office promising that Canada was back, but Canada lost the vote for the UN Security Council seat last June with 108 votes, 6 fewer votes than Canada got under the previous government a decade ago. On China and on India, the government's policies often seem incoherent and inconsistent with Canadian values and incoherent when it comes to our interests. So in general, I think the policies of the government in foreign affairs have been a disappointment.
Thank you for that. Monsieur Bergeron.
Merci, M. Ibbitson. Merci, Mme Kingston. Merci à tous d'être là ce soir. Très heureux d'y être également. Je suis de ceux qui pensent que les affaires étrangères se prêtent moins aux jeux partisans parce qu'il y a moins de clivage idéologique sur ces questions, parce que nous partageons des valeurs qui, sur le plan des affaires étrangères, sont relativement analogues. Et je pense aussi qu'il est toujours plus utile pour un pays de parler d'une seule voix sur la scène internationale. D'ailleurs, on s'ennuie tellement les uns des autres qu'en cette semaine de relâche, nous nous retrouvons pour parler d'affaires étrangères. Alors, c'est, je crois, significatif. Cela n'exclut pas que nous puissions avoir des divergences ponctuelles et vous en verrez probablement apparaître certaines ce soir. Certaines ont déjà été évoquées il y a quelques instants. On nous demande de parler de sécurité. Alors, évidemment, au chapitre de la sécurité, on peut certainement conclure que certaines des menaces héritées de la guerre froide sont toujours présentes. M. Ibbitson faisait référence à la Russie, à la Chine, qui, de l'aveu même de l'OTAN et des États-Unis, constitue l'un des plus grands défis auxquels nous devons faire face sur le plan sécuritaire. Le Canada l'expérimente à la dure présentement, mais on peut également penser au terrorisme, à la cybersécurité, aux pandémies, ce qui nous amène à un autre des thèmes qu'on nous demande d'aborder ce soir, la santé globale. Or, avec la présente pandémie, on a pu constater qu'il y a eu faillite des mécanismes de solidarité internationale. On a assisté à un déplorable chacun pour soi qui a fait en sorte qu'on assiste aujourd'hui encore à des disparités en termes de couverture et de vaccination entre les pays et une disparité entre pays développés et pays en développement. Ce qui a amené la communauté internationale à mettre sur pied l'initiative COVAX qui visait à faire en sorte d'assurer un minimum d'accès aux vaccins aux pays en développement avec les controverses dont vous avez entendu parler ces dernières semaines. Au chapitre de la prospérité, la pandémie elle-même et les conflits ponctuels, notamment avec notre partenaire américain, ont démontré les limites de la libéralisation des échanges sur une base strictement multilatérale. M. Chong faisait référence aux différentes ententes conclues par le Canada. Or, elles se sont révélées ces derniers temps peu utiles pour nous permettre de faire face à une crise comme celle à laquelle nous faisons face présentement. Au chapitre de la dignité humaine, la pandémie, on doit le noter, a exacerbé les inégalités et M. Oliphant faisait référence, les violations aux droits et libertés de la personne un peu partout à travers le monde. Je crois que c'est M. Ibbitson qui faisait référence également. L'attention du monde étant centrée vers la lutte à la pandémie, on a eu tendance à fermer les yeux sur un certain nombre de choses qui pouvaient se produire partout dans le monde. Une chose est certaine, c'est que les mouvements migratoires nous ont bien démontré que la communauté internationale doit être préoccupée par ces questions et qu'elle doit donc se ressaisir en cette crise à laquelle nous faisons face présentement. Alors, merci et au plaisir d'avoir l'occasion d'échanger au cours des prochaines minutes.
Thank you very much for that. And finally, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank Elizabeth Kingston and the CIC for organizing this event. And I look forward to hearing the results of your full dialogue in the near future with all of your participants. You know, the question, of course, is put before us is why foreign policy matters to Canadians and how do their perspectives strengthen Canada's place in the world? Well, I think it's very clear that Canadians care about foreign policy. We get dozens of letters, sometimes hundreds of letters, sometimes as many as 1,000 letters a day from Canadians who are concerned about matters going on in the world. And they're concerned because they feel that we are part of the world and they want Canada to be an important player in the world and to help to make a better world. Some of the obvious and major concerns that are facing all of us in the world today is the whole issue of climate change and the need to be very rigorous and deal with that issue in a positive way and in a committed way. And of course, the whole issue of the pandemic makes us very aware that we're part of what Marshall McLuhan called 50 years ago a global village. We're now living in the global village, and what happens somewhere else in the world matters to Canadians. So it's very important that we do that. Of course, as Social Democrats, we are concerned with having solidarity with the people of the world, and we want Canada to play a role in that. I want to say that there are at least 5 things that we would like to see Canada do better in the world. First of all, we need to meet Paris climate change targets, not just talk about them, not just have legislation, actually do that. We haven't done that yet. We want to see the COVAX system actually work and have Canadians do their fair share. We want to see human rights and arms control to be stepped up. We want to see greater activity on disarmament, and the official development assistance, which was pretty bad during the Harper years, is even worse now with the Liberals in power, and that's unfortunate.
Thank you for those concise explications of the priorities that each of you and your parties highlight in examining foreign policy. Let me ask just a question of each of you, if I may. And I'll start with you, Mr. Oliphant. Last week, the House of Commons voted without dissent to characterize the Chinese government's mistreatment of the Uyghur people as a genocide. You cast that vote yourself. But the Prime Minister and the Cabinet abstained on that vote. Why did the Prime Minister and the Cabinet abstain?
Well, first of all, I would thank Michael Chong for his work on this issue and raising it consistently, as well as members of other parties. This is the Uyghur issue, as some of you know, is a personal issue for me, that I have Uyghur constituents who have raised this issue with me for well over a decade. And we've been following it closely. The International Human Rights, the subcommittee has a report. It's not public yet. They did do a press conference which raised issues, and we're all reading in the press, and we're very aware of concerns that many in the world have raised about a variety of issues of persecution, of control, population control, of forced labor, etc., of the Uyghur people. But when the Prime Minister made it very clear it would be a free vote in the House, and he wanted to hear what the House said, and we didn't know what that would be. We didn't know how unanimous it would be, and I was delighted that the House was unanimous. The government has a higher bar. When the government has to receive an issue like that, they take Parliament's view, and will take it very seriously. But they'll be taking other information and working with allies as well, because they recognize, I think, as a government, that we want to work with partners, like-minded partners on this issue to be effective. And the government wants to be in step with like-minded partners. They recognize that now, you know, in the Netherlands, the parliament there has done something very similar, and their government did exactly what our government did. And it's that understanding of the difference between parliament and government, and the burden that's placed on a government to take this very carefully, cautiously, and do it. You can't say you believe in multilateral institutions and then not work through them. So our government is required to work through multilateral institutions, take it seriously, find the best way to improve the lives of the Uyghur people. And they'll do it. But they're listening to Parliament, and Parliament has spoken with one voice. And I think that it's incumbent upon the government to listen to that voice and then take it to the next step.
Listen as well, I might add, to to its own caucus, because the Liberal caucus overwhelmingly urged its government to declare this to be a genocide. Mr. Chong, you have been active on this file, and the Conservative government has taken a much more aggressive stand, I would say, towards the issue of relations with China and the abuses of human rights committed by that government. But they have two of our own, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Are you not placing at risk their possible freedom by taking such an aggressive stand?
Well, thank you, John, for the question. It's an important one. The short answer to your question is no. We believe, in fact, that China continues to threaten us because of the equivocation and passiveness of the current government's approach to China. If you look at what's happened over the last several years, because we've been equivocating on the question of China's threats to our interests and frankly to our values in the form of the Uyghur genocide, they've just continued with the belligerence. After Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor were wrongfully detained by Chinese authorities in December of 2018, China continued to threaten us. In fact, they subsequently slapped on non-tariff barriers to trade and went after Canadian canola, beef, and pork farmers. They have increasingly used belligerent rhetoric in the form of wolf warrior diplomacy against Canadian interests, Canadian citizens, Canadian companies. And so our view is that in the face of these threats, Canada has to take a stronger stand and make it clear to the Chinese communist regime that we will not be treated like a piñata on the global stage, that we will stand up for our interests, that we will stand up for our values. And that's why we've been calling on the government to take a stronger position on a range of bilateral issues in the Canada-China relationship. So that's our view, that the current government's approach is not working. And that's why we've been calling for that stronger position in the face of these threats.
Mr. Bergeron, one of the most serious troubles that we face in this year of pandemic is the closed Canada-US borders, which is wreaking havoc on the tourism and hospitality industries, on the transportation industry, and is also greatly inconveniencing Canadians who traditionally spend part of the year in the United States. We have a much lower infection rate than they do, but they have a much higher vaccination rate than we do. How would you go about opening the border between Canada and the United States, and how quickly would you like to see that border opened?
Je pense que le gouvernement a été bien avisé de fermer les frontières avec les États-Unis, particulièrement durant la période où, pour reprendre votre expression, le taux de contamination était beaucoup plus élevé et où il n'y avait pas de vaccination au sud de la frontière. Maintenant, je crois que les gouvernements se sont entendus pour commencer la réouverture progressive des frontières et je crois que c'est à l'avantage, bien sûr, des deux parties. On le sait, le commerce entre le Canada et les États-Unis est le plus important sur la planète. On parle de 2 milliards de transactions par jour. Et évidemment, la fermeture des frontières sur une longue période peut affecter à long terme la fluidité des transactions entre les deux pays. Il faut donc souhaiter effectivement que cette fermeture ne puisse être pérenne dans le temps. Il faut donc se réjouir du fait que les gouvernements aient convenu d'une réouverture progressive en appliquant bien sûr des mesures visant à assurer la sécurité lors des retours de part et d'autre de la frontière, mais avec cette vaccination qui va croissante et aux États-Unis et on l'espère également au Canada, il y a lieu de penser que nous pourrons accélérer cette ouverture des frontières et retrouver un flux de transactions qui soit à la hauteur de celui que nous avons connu avant le début de la pandémie.
Finally, Mr. Harris, one of the most encouraging signs in recent weeks has been the commitment of the Biden administration and the Trudeau government to work together to produce some meaningful reductions in carbon emissions. But they seem to be talking about a kind of continental standard, a joint binational approach. Would your party support the idea of a continental approach to carbon emission reductions, such as cap and trade and fuel standards and the like, or should we be protecting our sovereignty and pursuing our own national individual goals?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a question of sovereignty here. I think we share, I think it's very good that both Canada and the United States are on the same page with respect to climate change, because that's actually what the whole world has to do. Canada, I mean, there were those voices in Canada say, well, we don't matter because we're only producing 2% of the world's carbon emissions, so we can produce what we like. Well, that's not the right attitude, and it wasn't the right attitude of Mr. Trump and his administration. So it's much better for us and for the world to have both countries on the same page, both taking this issue seriously, because this is going to require not just Canada and the United States, but the entire world to be on the same page if we are going to solve this problem. And it is the single most important problem facing the world today. We obviously have a greater, more urgent one in the sense of the pandemic. We're dealing with that as we can, but on the long term, this is important. So having the countries work together is important. What worries me is that Canada should not be put in a situation where the United States is hot to trot on this issue and starts investing heavily in innovation and in change, and Canada is left behind. So we have got to work in tandem. Getting rid of the Buy American, getting an exemption from that is very helpful. If there's going to be innovation, we have to be able to participate in that. We have to do our share as well and support that kind of innovation in Canada so that we're not left behind. So I think there has to be coordination and cooperation, but I think if that's a two-way street, and I think we both have to be involved in that. And I don't think there's a loss of sovereignty involved if we're working towards the same goal, and there's not we're not a victim of their larger market. We have to be equal participants.
I think the vital importance of receiving a Canadian exemption from Buy American is something we could find all party support for in this debate.
Absolutely.
I could go to a second round of questions on my own, but I'm looking at the questions in chat and in Q&A, and they're really interesting. So I think we should get to what I think is probably going to be the best part of the discussion, which is to hear from those who are watching this debate. And I'm going to start with Professor Spencer Henson of the Guelph Institute of Development Studies. He points out that over the last 3 decades, government spending on aid as a proportion of national income has stagnated, to say the least. The effectiveness of our aid has probably suffered as well from some lack of coherence. I'm paraphrasing here. This is not something that the average Canadian cares very much about, it has to be said, but as a result, it is largely an afterthought for the major political parties. What concrete steps can be taken to position Canada as a leader on aid? And Mr. Bergeron, I'll start with you.
Écoutez, c'est très intéressant parce que nous sommes justement en train de nous pencher sur cette question au niveau du Comité des affaires étrangères et du développement international. Et on a vu dans le débat des points de vue s'opposer quant à la contribution qui doit être faite par le Canada à ce chapitre. Et évidemment, les points de vue sont divergents quant à la performance, mais je pense que sur le fond, tous et toutes s'entendent quant au fait qu'il nous faut faire davantage. La question est de savoir, avec les moyens limités dont nous disposons, qu'est-ce qui est possible de faire de plus? Je faisais référence tout à l'heure à la question de l'initiative COVAX et le fait qu'il y ait une disparité entre les pays développés et les pays en voie de développement quant à l'accès aux vaccins. Or, lorsqu'on soumet au gouvernement qu'il était plus ou moins approprié de recourir à cette espèce de pool de vaccins au détriment des pays en développement. Le Canada nous dit, le gouvernement canadien nous dit, oui, mais nous avons commandé un très grand nombre de vaccins et le surplus pourra éventuellement être redistribué aux pays en développement. Donc, quant aux moyens, évidemment, les points de vue sont divergents, mais je pense que sur le fond, quant à l'objectif à atteindre, nous sommes tous et toutes d'accord. La question est de savoir comment maintenant nous entendre sur les moyens de faire en sorte de transformer ces intentions en gestes concrets.
Rather than going all the way around the horn, I'll try to maybe just keep it to one or two of each of you on each individual question so that we can get the most questions in. So I'll end this question with by flicking over to you, Mr. Oliphant. Lester Pearson was the father of foreign aid in Canada. No government, liberal or conservative, has ever matched the goals or the targets that he set for foreign aid. Do you ever expect to see a time when any government, especially liberal government, will ever live up to the challenge that Lester Pearson set for us?
Still live in that hope, and I don't think I'm well on the record to say that Canada should be increasing its humanitarian assistance, its development aid, and whether it's 0.7, I don't know what the magic number is. I'm not sure where it is, but I know we're not doing enough in Canada, and Western countries generally are not doing enough. Rarely do foreign issues, international concerns dominate elections. That doesn't happen. It's usually about domestic issues. In the last election, though, I was actually kind of pleased that the Conservative Party had in their mandate, in their platform, to cut development assistance by 25%. And that gave us actually an opportunity to talk about it and to say that is not what Canadians want. And I heard at the door more comments than usual about the need to keep foreign aid at a reasonable level. What that reasonable level is, I don't know. As Mr. Bergeron said, we've been looking at the impact of COVID on the poorest, the most vulnerable in our world. Canada has to do more. I will continue to advocate for that, but I'll also advocate not just to the government, but to Canadians generally. It is still not widely held by Canadians across this country about the importance. And I think COVID-19 helps a bit because until everyone is free of COVID, no one is free of COVID. It's the same about poverty. It's the same about disease. It's the same about famine. It's the same about every issue. Until the whole world have roofs over their head, food on their table, we are all hungry and we're all homeless. And I'll keep fighting for that.
Jim Cox makes a very astute observation. He says that expressions of foreign policy have often tended to prefer style over substance, activity over achievement. Can any party provide just one defined, measurable foreign policy goal, something concrete to be achieved? Mr. Chong, could your party create such a goal, such a measure?
Well, that's a great question, Jim. Thank you for asking it. I share your view on this, that there's a gap between our rhetoric on the world stage and what action we deliver. In terms of identifiable, quantifiable goals, climate change is one of the most important ones. Canada has made climate change commitments now through a number of international treaties. The Kyoto Protocol was the first one. Subsequently, the Copenhagen Accord, which targets were missed last year, and the next one is the Paris Accord. And that, to me, is one of the big foreign policy goals that we have to accomplish. John Ibbitson mentioned earlier in the conversation in the context of the North American integrated economy, but also globally. So to me, that's a quantifiable goal that we all have as Canadians, that both Liberals and Conservatives have signed on to, a 30% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. That is something that we as a country must be seized with, that we must work together to try to achieve over the next 9 short years. Thank you for the question.
Mr. Harris, would you care to weigh in on that?
Yes, I would. And I would say in terms of Canadian support for internationalism, the foreign policy initiative that Canada could take that would do that would be actually to meet this 0.7% of GDP commitment. And Mr. Oliphant took advantage of his time to criticize the Conservatives for not doing more in international development aid and threatening to cut their contribution. And yet his government did actually that. They actually contributed less than the Harper government did to international development aid. 0.7 of GDP would mean a true underscoring of Canada's commitment to the world and make sure that we're making a contribution to Africa, African nations that need our help, to Asian nations that need our help, and to make sure that we're able to do the kind of things that Canadians want to do, that Ireland and Norway committed to when they were seeking to be part of the Security Council, and Canada was left behind because we weren't even in the race. So this is something that I think Canadians would, we are in favor of this. We have in election platform after another made that commitment and said we shall do it in a targeted way and move it step by step up to that commitment. And I think that would define more what Canada means to the world than we have so far.
I would point out, which I probably shouldn't do, that there have been successes, and in fact, the best successes I would maintain are ones in which the two governing parties have built on top of the achievements of the other. One that I would point out is the Maternal Health Initiative that Stephen Harper, when he was Prime Minister, was able to spearhead and convince the members of the G7 to champion. And then the Liberal government, Mr. Trudeau, built on that initiative and broadened it. That was actually a foreign policy achievement. And I would suggest that in foreign aid and other things, the two parties work best when one succeeds the other and builds on the other's achievements. But I have a question here from Colin Tomczyk. Tomczyk, yes. Prime Minister, Mr. Oliphant, this is for you. Prime Minister Trudeau said Canada's treatment of, excuse me, it has jumped and I have lost it, but I can remember what it was he was going to ask, who he had asked. He had pointed out that Canada has a feminist foreign policy and that our foreign policy initiatives are filtered through a lens of feminist values. How do you reconcile that with selling arms to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I'll talk first about the feminist foreign policy and the feminist development policy. We have two of those, and they're very concrete. They talk about whether it's sexual and reproductive health and making sure that that happens, that we have an agenda that says when women and girls succeed in developing countries, the whole community succeeds and the country succeeds. And we've done that very specifically with I know we have many former diplomats in the audience this evening, and we now have 50% of our ambassadors, our high commissioners, the heads of our missions around the world are women, and 50% are men. And we are attempting to continue to do that. With respect to Saudi Arabia, this is, China's complex. Let's acknowledge this, it's multidimensional and complex. Saudi Arabia, we have raised the issues of human rights publicly, very publicly, when it has come to women in Saudi Arabia, more so than any other country in the world has. And we've raised them privately. And we've done that, I think, effectively. Are we there yet? No. Has Saudi Arabia changed its agenda? Have they adopted even the basic minimum level of human rights for women? Not to our satisfaction, absolutely not. Is there light towards the end of the tunnel? We see small rays that have happened that we are hopeful of, but it is not for lack of Canada's statements on this, and it's not for lack of Canada's actions on this. As someone said, we've had several foreign ministers, and each of them have taken on the issue of Saudi Arabia absolutely clearly and forcefully. Several ministers, one really good parliamentary secretary for the last three of them, I will acknowledge. But we need to keep doing that, and we'll keep doing it. But we don't do it alone either. You have to do that in step with the world. So we're watching the Biden administration. It's continuing. Other countries will continue, but we don't have as many allies on that as we need. So we need to build allies and friends as well on that project.
A question, by the way, the questions are best when they're shortest. And this one is one that I'm going to go around to ask all four of you. And of course, it's jumped and I've lost the name of the person who asked it, but I remember the question, which is, what, to your mind, is the single greatest security threat facing Canada in 2021? Now, let's go in reverse order. Mr. Harris, you start. What is the single greatest security threat this country faces today?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the security threat that we all face is one related to the internet and to the cybersecurity threats that we see, the ability of other countries to penetrate industrial plant to potentially affect hydroelectric activity and systems. So I think, you know, from the world is very different now than it was only a few years ago. And we do see that cybersecurity and the ability of other countries to influence and to affect in a material way the operation of significant industrial plant and essential utilities and all of that is there. I think that that's probably the biggest security threat at this point.
Mr. Bergeron.
Je vous dirais que je suis évidemment d'accord avec mon collègue, mais le monde a cessé de tourner, pour ainsi dire, depuis plusieurs mois en raison d'une pandémie. Or, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, nous signale que nous ne sommes pas à l'abri d'autres pandémies à l'avenir. Et je pense que le monde était mal préparé à cette pandémie, que le monde a mal réagi à cette pandémie et qu'il nous faut donc nous préparer de façon beaucoup plus rigoureuse à la prochaine, non seulement sur le plan national, sur le plan de nos systèmes de santé au niveau de chacune des provinces, mais également à l'échelle internationale. Comme je le disais dans mon allocution d'ouverture, il y a un certain nombre de mécanismes de solidarité internationale qui ont failli à la tâche lorsque le virus a fait son apparition et s'est transformé en pandémie. Il faut donc, je pense, tirer les leçons de cette expérience extrêmement traumatisante qui aura littéralement mis le monde sur pause pendant plusieurs mois et nous préparer de façon beaucoup plus convenable à faire face à d'autres épisodes pandémiques qui pourraient survenir dans le futur.
I think it is certainly true that if even a little more than a year ago, someone had said the single greatest security threat facing Canada and the world was a virus, a pandemic, very few people would have acknowledged that or thought that that this was indeed the biggest threat that we face. Mr. Chong, if you had to pick one single security threat facing this country, what would that be?
Well, thank you, John. These binary questions are always difficult to answer, but I'll make my best attempt. I think the biggest threat we are facing in 2021 is the digital threat. You know, if you look at the threats that are coming to Western democracies, they are largely taking the form of threats that are coming in the digital form. I think about, you know, the decision by the 4 of the 5 Eyes to ban or severely restrict Huawei from the build out of the core of the 5G networks. I think about the theft of intellectual property. I think about the theft or the cyber attacks that authoritarian states and entities acting on behalf of authoritarian states are presenting to both private sector companies and to governments. I think about the rise of massive amounts of disinformation on the internet through social media platforms that have led to the rise of conspiracy theories, that have led to disinformation on vaccines, disinformation on the pandemic, that have led to QAnon and, you know, a complete alternative reality that people have concocted. So I think that, you know, if you look at the events that culminated in on January 6th, just over a month ago in Washington, D.C., if you look at other events that have taken place more recently, it's clear that disinformation that conspiracy theories, that the rise of white supremacism, the rise of threats to our intellectual property regime, threats to our national security in the form of cyber attacks, all that is the digital threat. And I think Canada needs to have a strategy, a foreign policy on digital. We need to realize that that's no longer a nice to have and an optional, that it has to form the core of what our foreign policy, one of the elements of our foreign policy, something that Derek Burney and Finn Hampson recently articulated in the book that they published about a year ago.
Mr. Oliphant, take your parliamentary secretary hat off, if you wouldn't mind, for a minute. Don't speak on behalf of the government. Just speak on your own behalf. What keeps you up at night? What is the one great security threat that you worry about that Canada has to deal with in the coming years?
I think if I had answered first, I probably would have had an answer very similar to what Jack Harris said, and also what Michael Chong. So I think that probably I would have been where I'd gone first. If I'd had a second chance, I would have gone where Mr. Bergeron went, who articulated very well the current problem. But I think underneath both of those is something even more fundamental. I think the biggest security threat in the world is gross, massive inequality and the disparities that are happening in our world. It is between the wealthy and the poor. People with power, democratic power, civil power, human rights kind of power over others, people who are left out. And as long as we have a world with such gross inequalities, that will be an opportunity. It's like an opportunistic infection. It will be an opportunity for the cyber crimes and misinformation. It'll be the opportunity for further bullying of the poor. As long as there's inequality between men and women, between the North and the South, it is to me an underlying foundational problem that we have to fix. And you don't fix it just by more money. You have to fix it by a concerted effort around parliamentary or democratic rights, around the furthering of human rights and civil rights, of the furthering of economic opportunity, of making sure that we have ways to actually take on the bullies of the world and not have a new colonialism. I mean, it even is an opportunity for China to move in, to African countries, to be a new colonial power. And we've got to thwart that. We've got to make sure we do that by raising people up and dealing with the inequalities in our world. And it's too easy for us in the West, in the North, in Canada, to sit here and to recognize that, yes, there are threats to our security, but those threats are about our privilege. And we just have to find new ways to address that. That's Rob, the minister, the pastor, coming in here. That's my kind of United Church thing that, and we're not there yet. So I try to put the parliamentary secretary hat on that one as well, but I don't think anyone disagrees with that on this panel either. I think that we know that in Canada. We've got to do better on.
This next question, we'll start with Mr. Chong, then Mr. Oliphant, then Mr. Harris, then Mr. Bergeron, just because I've never done it that way before yet. We've focused a lot on China, as well we should. Not that many years ago, though, we were focusing more intensely on Russia. Again, I think we can claim some foreign policy successes here. It was the Harper government that led the charge to expel Russia from the G8, return to the G7. We were a leader in protecting the rights of Ukraine, passing Magnitsky sanctions. And the Trudeau government followed those policies in the main and toughened many of them. I think no one would say that Chrystia Freeland, as foreign minister, was soft on Russia. But there is a sense, I think, that Russia has sort of fallen onto the back burner, partly because of the rise of China. But I note that the Biden government administration is imposing new Magnitsky sanctions on Russia. Is it time for Canada to follow suit? What would you do next in order to remind Vladimir Putin that the mischief he's trying to get away with in Canada as well, speaking of cyber, is noted and not going to be tolerated? Mr. Chong.
Well, that's a great question, John. I think there's a number of things we can do. I think we have to act multilaterally with respect to Russia. And so we should be joining with the European Union and with the United States in sanctioning those individuals close to President Putin who have been engaging in these egregious human rights abuses, who have been supportive of the what's going on in Belarus, what's been going on in Crimea. And so at minimum, we should be sanctioning in concert with the European Union and the United States those individuals close to President Putin, particularly those oligarchs close to him. And so we're calling on the government to do exactly that. Frankly, it's puzzling that hasn't already happened, seeing that the European Union and the Biden administration have already moved. I think we should also be signaling now that we are going to extend the missions in Ukraine, Operation Unifier, and the missions in Eastern Europe, Operation Reassurance, clearly sending the signal that we are committed for the long term to these NATO missions and to the security of the Eastern European Union. So those are two things that I think the government could act on immediately that would be in the multilateral spirit, and that would also show us to be working in concert with our allies vis-a-vis the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin regime.
Mr. Oliphant, what do you think? And now I will ask you to put your parliamentary hat back on. What can and should the government be doing to maintain and increase the pressure on Russia?
I think Michael Chong has raised some really very important issues, both on the stuff we have already done, whether it's about Crimea, whether it's about Ukraine in general, about territorial integrity, about the way Russia is with its neighbors. And we have made strong statements and taken strong actions, both with respect to defense and with respect to security. I think in recent weeks or months, the story of Alexei Navalny has caught Canadians and it's caught people around the world about the atrocious use of chemical weapons, about the failure of Russia and President Putin's regime to bring those responsible to trial and to justice, to continue that intimidation of his followers by our really arbitrary arrests that are going on. And Canada has spoken about those, but I would say that it is time for us to actually be meeting very clearly with our EU allies, with our NATO allies, with our American counterparts to say what's next. How do we exercise more pressure? It's never easy. We always know that sanctions are done best when they're done in concert with other countries. We want to squeeze Russia, absolutely, but not squeeze them out of conversation. And so that's the fine art of finding a way to put the pressure on, but keep dialogue going. And so that's the government's responsibility. But actually, as Micah was speaking, I took notes and very important things that he was saying. And this is where I think Mr. Bergeron said earlier that this is where we should be less partisan on our issues of foreign policy and build a dialogue or a conversation in Canada among the parties about how to handle Russia. I would think that a Liberal government won't do it the best unless we do it with NDP and Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives and find a way.
Then let's ask them. Mr. Harris, do you think that that the parties can act together to place increased pressure on Russia, and how should they act?
Well, I think you've raised a very important question, John, because what's been happening in Russia over the last number of years is and the rise of authoritarianism that we've seen with Mr. Putin and his grasp on power is unacceptable in the world, and I think it's unacceptable to Russians. Ultimately, we're seeing some pushback on the streets, it's not strong enough to make a change in Russia. But I think the people of Russia need to have the support and know that Canadians and people around the world do support them having a more democratic approach to things, and that the things that are happening now with the treatment of the leader of the opposition are abhorrent to the world, and they should be abhorrent to Russians. And I think you're right. We do what we're doing in Eastern Europe. We support with the support for the nations on the border with Russia, to give them some assurance that we support them and their independence and their own democratic institutions, and attempt to build those and strengthen those. And Michael has made some good suggestions, and I think there's probably a cross-party support for finding initiatives that will work, and that may give some hope to the people of Russia that this is not going to last forever.
Mr. Bergeron.
Je crois qu'il ne me reste plus grand-chose à dire, sinon que je suis d'accord avec mes collègues. Effectivement, je pense que nous avons une fenêtre d'opportunité absolument extraordinaire présentement. On assiste à, je dirais, un premier mouvement d'opposition organisé en Russie qui a certainement besoin de sentir qu'il y a une solidarité de la part des pays démocratiques à l'égard de ce qu'ils vivent présentement et des limitations qui sont exercées par le pouvoir en place aux libertés, aux droits et libertés des citoyens et des citoyennes et à leurs droits démocratiques, en fait, plus précisément. On faisait référence un peu plus tôt à la cyber-intervention d'un certain nombre de pays, dont la Russie, dans les élections de pays démocratiques. Je pense que nous avons une occasion, sans nous abaisser à ce genre de pratique, nous avons une occasion de favoriser présentement le régime démocratique ou du moins les institutions démocratiques ou ce qui en reste en Russie en témoignant de notre solidarité à l'égard des opposants qui manifestent et qui subissent des répressions terribles dues à leur participation à des manifestations souvent au départ pacifiques. Et je crois effectivement que nous devons nous entendre sur un certain nombre de mesures. Nous entendre entre nous, bien sûr, mais nous entendre entre pays industrialisés, entre pays démocratiques pour agir de façon concertée à l'égard de régimes comme celui de la Russie, celui de la Chine. Je voyais des personnes dans le chat nous parler de Cuba. Nous avons choisi à l'égard de Cuba d'appliquer la politique de Jean Chrétien, c'est-à-dire de dire qu'avec le commerce, nous allons faire changer les choses à Cuba. Les États-Unis ont adopté la voie complètement inverse en disant nous allons tout couper avec Cuba et nous allons les amener à changer. Manifestement, ni une voie ni l'autre n'a mené au résultat escompté. Peut-être devons-nous travailler de façon davantage concertée pour en arriver effectivement à des résultats concrets en bout de piste, plutôt que de simplement parler, mais sans jamais en arriver à des résultats tangibles en bout de piste.
Well, I think if there is a consensus amongst the members of Parliament today, it is that we need to work together, both intra-party and internationally, to confront the great security challenges that we have. We have time for one last question and still keep this on time. And it's from Gerald Wright, who's a CIC board member. Mr. Wright, I'm going to paraphrase you because I want to add something of my own as well. Critics contend that Canada has a sporadic involvement in the Asia Pacific. We talk a good game. We don't often do all that much to have all that much to show for it. And yes, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or whatever the Liberals want to call it now. But what have you done for us lately? Especially, Mr. Wright points out, Canada seems to be lackadaisical and unsuccessful in its efforts to gain admission to the East Asia Summit, which now is emerging, I think, as one of the most powerful and important international, far more than talking shops, a genuine place where policy gets decided. Why are we failing to get on there, and what more can we do to emphasize the importance of Asia Pacific and Canada as a Pacific as well as an Atlantic nation? Mr. Chong, you lead off.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think Canada needs to be far more present in Asia Pacific. If there's one thing I've heard from my consultations with foreign policy experts in the last 4 months, it's that Canada simply isn't present. Yes, we send people to the various fora in Asia, Indo-Pacific, but often we don't send a high-level delegation, a ministerial delegation, and as a result, we're not treated as seriously as we should be. So I believe that, for starters, we should be making every effort we can to join the quadrilateral security dialogue. Many believe that that could evolve into an Eastern NATO. Canada was present for the creation of the Western Alliance some 75 years ago, NATO, and I think we should be working much more closely with partners, democratic partners like the Republic of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States to join that dialogue. It's my hope that the Prime Minister raised that in his bilateral meeting with President Biden. It's my hope that he raised it with Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister and the Prime Ministers of both Australia and Japan. I think that's one critical interest that Canada has. This dialogue, this quadrilateral security dialogue is evolving into a democratic alliance to counter China's increasing threats in the South China Seas and generally in Indo-Pacific. I also think we need to respect the professional foreign service at Global Affairs Canada. I think that what I've heard is that when we appoint people to empty ambassadorial positions, that they should be coming from the ranks of the professional public service. My view is that there really only should be 2 or 3 ambassadorial positions that are political appointments: the Canadian ambassador to Washington, the Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, and the Canadian ambassador to Paris, to France. I think outside of that, particularly when we're looking at an opaque government like China's and Beijing, that it should be a professional appointed from the ranks of the public service to that position, who is a lifelong China hand, as they say, who understands the system over there, can speak the language, and who can best represent our interests. So that's the second thing I think we need to do, is to rely much more heavily on the expertise within global affairs and on the professional public servants who have spent a lifetime developing that expertise. So those, and just a short answer, those are just 2 things I think we need to do to strengthen our role in Indo-Pacific.
It's odd. I live in West Ottawa, and yet I thought I heard cheers from Sussex Drive all the way across the city. Mr. Harris, it's the other side of the world for you. Do you fear that an increased emphasis on Asia-Pacific issues will cause the neglect of Atlantic issues?
Well, I think, you started off with the question of sporadic efforts being made. We've got to up our game internationally. I mean, people think of ourselves as a world nation, but we have been sporadic in a lot of things. We need to up our game in Africa, go back to providing the kind of support that we have in the past. We have India is a huge subcontinent that's English speaking, although they have 100 languages. There's something that we can build relationships with. We do have a foothold, obviously, with Australia because of our ties Commonwealth-wise. And so we do have opportunities to be more engaged in that part of the world already without any additional effort, but we will have to make additional effort. Mr. Chong has put forth some suggestions that I think are important as well. But we have to be, that has to be a commitment from the people of Canada, not just foreign policy wonks or people like yourself who are intelligent observers and commentators on these things. There has to be a reason that Canadians feel that we need to be engaged there, and someone has to build support for that before we can fully make the kind of sustained commitment that's required to do it, because it's expensive for us to do. We're not meeting, and I go back to the official development date. We're not meeting that commitment yet, and that's fairly basic. So we need to build support for that before we can actually do it.
Mr. Bergeron, and then I'm going to cut it off. Mr. Oliphant, my apologies, but if I don't, we'll be running short on time. So, sir.
Écoutez, je crois que les interventions de mes collègues sont tout à fait pertinentes. Moi, je pense qu'il doit y avoir un signal sur le plan politique. Sous un précédent gouvernement, nous avions un secrétaire d'État qui s'occupait spécifiquement des questions touchant l'Asie-Pacifique. Et nous avions un secrétaire d'État qui s'occupait spécifiquement des questions touchant l'Afrique et l'Amérique latine. Et il y avait un signal qui était envoyé par le gouvernement canadien quant à l'importance qu'il accordait aux relations à développer avec ces parties du monde. Or, nous avons fait marche arrière quant à ce signal qui était donné. Puis je pourrais faire un parallèle bien simple. Lorsque le Canada a laissé le poste d'ambassadeur à Beijing vacant pendant plusieurs mois, il y avait un signal qui était envoyé à travers cette vacance prolongée. Alors, je pense qu'on a un signal à donner, à la fois par rapport à l'Asie-Pacifique, mais également par rapport à d'autres régions. Je pense notamment à l'Afrique. L'Afrique est, selon toutes les évaluations, le continent qui va connaître la plus grande croissance sur le plan démographique et économique au cours des prochaines années. Et je pense que la Chine a très bien compris que l'Afrique est le continent de l'avenir en investissant massivement en Afrique. Et pendant ce temps-là, nous sommes absents, ou presque, du territoire africain. Donc, je pense qu'il faut s'intéresser de nouveau à l'Afrique, il faut s'intéresser de nouveau à l'Amérique latine et il faut également, bien sûr, continuer à s'intéresser activement à l'Asie-Pacifique et donner un signal clair qu'il y a un objectif qui est poursuivi par le gouvernement du Canada à cet égard.
I'm going to overrule myself and then change the rules. So, Ms. Kingston, because I am very keen to hear what Mr. Oliphant would have to say about what should be the next act in Asia Pacific now that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is done. Where should the next Liberal priority be? And then we will do a round of closing remarks, but I will ask you to limit yourself to 1 minute rather than 2 so that we can get everything in.
I will be short. I think it's critical for Canada and Canadians to recognize that we're a Pacific country. We are, of course, an Atlantic country. We're a country bordering on the United States, but we're a Pacific Rim country. And I wouldn't underestimate the emergence and the importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. It is absolutely critical to open doors. And it is not that we are not at the EAS, the East Asian Summit, EAS, whatever it's called, or ASEAN. We're at both those fora, and we are ensuring that we have representation there. Do we want more? Yes. Do we want that sort of permanent observer status? Yes. Do we want more engagement? Yes. But we're not naive. The world, the globe shifts. And I actually keep a globe on my desk in Ottawa to remind myself that I don't want to look at the world in only one way. We have looked far too long towards the United States for trade and cultural reasons. We looked far too long to the founding countries that colonized Canada, England, the UK, and France. We have to look to the other side of the world. And we're doing that. We're doing it strategically. We're also doing it with, frankly, a very professional public service that, and I try not to get defensive at these things. The last 5 years, we have been trying to unleash the foreign service officers of this country. We've been trying to unleash and allow the imagination and the innovation of those foreign service officers to come forward. They were absolutely stifled for almost 10 years. And we are still finding an emerging professional public service that is among the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And they will help lead the government no matter what the party is. So we'll keep doing that.
Let us then move to closing statements. And we will start with you, Mr. Harris. We'll do it in reverse order then. So Mr. Harris, Mr. Bergeron, Mr. Chong, and Mr. Oliphant. Go ahead. We need to be unmuted here.
Mute, and I'll have to put my
there you go. Okay, you're good.
Counter back. Okay, so thank you for the very interesting evening, colleagues. And I'll just end by saying one of the problems that we have is the lack of a coherent framework for Canada's internationalism. We've had a series of foreign ministers in the last little while. Yes, we have to be engaged, as Mr. Oliphant pointed out, in the institutions of the Pacific as well as the Atlantic. Yes, we have to do all these things. A number of people tonight have talked about Cuba. We haven't talked about ourselves, but where is our consistent policy with respect to Cuba? We missed out on an opportunity to build a relationship as they are seeking to have a stronger relationship with North America. Where where are we when it comes to important work that we've been, we're supposed to be back, but the evidence for us being back is somewhat lacking to date. We are more than simply a middle power. We're actually the 10th largest economy in the world, and we do have a strong role to play. We have to put that forward and play that strong role by committing more of our own resources to international support and the development. Picking targets, yes, maternal health is a very positive thing for us to champion because it has so many effects on the future of populations of the world and particularly developing countries, and that's something that's a very good thing. But having a marquee statements and ideas is a good thing, but we need to have a consistent and sustained effort to make a real difference.
Mr. Bergeron.
Alors, merci beaucoup. Merci aux collègues. Merci encore aux organisateurs de cet événement de nous avoir donné l'opportunité de débattre de questions qui nous passionnent, littéralement, les questions touchant les affaires étrangères. Dans une des questions qui nous a été posée ce soir, on nous a mis au défi de ne pas nous en tenir aux vœux pieux, de ne pas nous en tenir simplement à des grands principes, mais de faire en sorte de les traduire en gestes concrets. En d'autres termes, pour reprendre une expression québécoise, faire en sorte que les bottines suivent les babines. Et il faut remarquer à cet égard que malheureusement, les bottines ne suivent pas toujours les babines. On l'a vu, par exemple, sur la question de l'aide au développement. Nous sommes tous et toutes d'accord quant au fait qu'il faille accroître la contribution du Canada à l'aide au développement. Et pourtant, ça ne se traduit pas en gestes concrets. Si ça se trouve, nous réduisons progressivement notre contribution. On parlait de l'initiative qui a été, M. Oliphant parlait de l'initiative du Canada au niveau des détentions arbitraires. Alors, c'est certainement une initiative qui est extrêmement positive et il faut la saluer. Mais comment se fait-il que pendant que nous parlons de détention arbitraire, nous laissons des enfants citoyens canadiens croupir dans des camps de réfugiés au nord de la Syrie? Il faut intervenir. On parle d'une politique féministe. Vous l'avez souligné, M. Ibbitson, nous parlons d'une politique féministe et pendant ce temps, nous continuons à vendre des armes à l'Arabie saoudite, alors même qu'un groupe d'experts internationaux sur le Yémen a demandé au Canada de cesser toute exportation. C'était la toute première fois que le Canada était identifié comme étant l'un des pays contribuant à la poursuite du conflit au Yémen. Alors, c'est extrêmement préoccupant que d'être ainsi pointé du doigt. On parlait bien sûr du génocide des Ouïghours. Or, le gouvernement, vous l'avez encore une fois souligné, M. Ibbitson, s'est abstenu lors du vote, prétextant n'avoir pas suffisamment d'informations sur ce qui se passait sur place et invoquant le fait qu'il fallait que des observateurs internationaux aillent sur place, aller chercher les informations. Or, le Canada, vous le savez, a des obligations en vertu de la Convention sur les génocides et le silence ne fait pas partie de ces obligations. Or, j'avais l'impression, à entendre le ministre des Affaires étrangères, d'entendre les officiels d'Affaires mondiales Canada qui, au Comité des Affaires étrangères, nous disaient, concernant le conflit du Haut-Karabakh, qu'ils n'avaient pas la moindre idée de ce qui se passait sur le terrain. Or, dans une comparution subséquente, le précédent ministre des Affaires étrangères nous a avoué candidement qu'il savait très bien ce qui se passait sur le terrain. Donc, ce que j'assume aujourd'hui, c'est que le ministre des Affaires étrangères sait très bien ce qui se passe en Chine et que c'est un manque de volonté politique qui a fait que le gouvernement ne s'est pas prononcé sur cette question. Cessons simplement d'avoir des valeurs affichées et faisons en sorte que ces valeurs affichées se traduisent en gestes concrets, que les bottines suivent enfin les babines.
Mr. Bergeron, those were some very uncomfortable observations, and I thank you for them. The penultimate words to the Conservatives, Mr. Chong. You are muted, sir.
Merci, Monsieur Ibbitson et Madame Kingston pour m'inviter aujourd'hui pour parler sur les enjeux des affaires étrangères. Je pense que les affaires étrangères, c'est clair, ça concerne nos intérêts canadiens, nos concitoyens, nos compagnies canadiennes, notre économie et les choses comme ça. But foreign policy is more than just defending our fellow citizens, our interests, our economy. It's also about our values. And if I see two challenges that we have in the area of foreign policy, it's first, that we need to re-articulate from first principles the values on which we're based, a belief in democratic institutions, a belief in liberties and freedoms for all people around the world, and a belief in the rule of law. And we have to be confident about those long-held principles that Western democracies have all been based on for some centuries now, and re-articulate them in the face of an increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world, and an increasing lack of confidence in these first principles, in the face of other ideologies and alternative viewpoints. I think the other challenge that we're facing is one that concerns prosperity. Any foreign policy needs to be backed by action, and any country that has a robust foreign policy, a robust overseas official development assistance program, a robust response to climate change, a robust commitment to security, needs to back that up with action. And that requires a prosperous and growing economy. And I think the big challenge that we're facing coming out of this pandemic is an economy that is in need of growth and in need of productivity, in need of so many other things that are challenged because of the economic fallout from this pandemic. So the two challenges that I see in foreign policy, first, we need to be confident about the first principles on which Western democracies are based, re-articulate them for a new era, and be confident about the projection of those principles and those values around the world. And secondly, we need to have a robust plan for economic recovery from this pandemic in order to ensure that we have the growing government revenues necessarily to back up that projection of our foreign policy with real action. Thank you, John, and thank you, Elizabeth, for having me here tonight.
I'll bet those are two sentiments that could also have all party support. But nonetheless, the last word goes to the governing party, Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, John, and Elizabeth, and to the CIC for hosting this. But I think even a bigger thanks to my colleagues. What I'm reminded on when we're doing this sort of thing, and I've sort of thrown out my closing remarks, which I had written. That's always dangerous. But I am reminded tonight that no party has a monopoly on a way ahead, on the truth. The world is complex. It is multi-layered and multi-dimensional, and that one action in one place causes a reaction in another place. And we try to find pathways that honor those values that Michael was just speaking of, but also make the differences that Stefan and Jack were speaking of. And I think Canada and our world would be poorer if Pearson hadn't developed that humanitarian internationalism as well as peacekeeping. But I think our world would also be poor if Brian Mulroney hadn't taken on apartheid and acid rain. And I think our world would be poorer if Stephen Lewis hadn't gone to Africa and brought Africa back to Canada in the height of the AIDS crisis. And inspired us to do better. And I think just a few examples of the kinds of political leadership that I think Canadians want. And I've been in opposition. I've been in government. I like government better. I like to stay there. But there's a certain freedom in opposition to raise issues. And we want that done. But we're not naive about these things. We know there are Canadians in northeastern Syria being held by Kurds. And if it were a simple thing to bring them home, it would have been done. We know there are Canadians arbitrarily detained in China. If it were a simple thing, we would have brought them home. We know there are inequalities. We know all of those things. We are not naive to them. What you try to do is find a way to cause as little damage as possible and to promote Canadian values of inclusion,
of democracy, of human rights as we move. And we'll do it better if we do it together, because everyone has something to contribute to this. I have been watching the questions. I hope that I could get a copy of them because I wasn't able to follow them fast enough. I'm happy to respond to people individually. Several good thoughts there, but they went by too quickly. So that's a request that we have that and that we do this more often. There's no election in the near future, so we have time to do this a few times before we have an election, and then Canadians will be better informed as to how we all can move on together. Thanks.
I'll hold you to that, Mr. Oliphant, that there is no election in our near future. Ms. Kingston, I apologize. We went on a little bit long, but it was so good, it was hard to stop. But I take it back to you.
And Mr. Ibbitson, I entirely agree with you that it was not at all possible to stop at the allotted time, given the tremendous conversation. And we will make sure that you have the questions that are in the chat, so you may respond. And Mr. Oliphant, I couldn't think of a better way to sum it up, actually, the way that you said that foreign policy for Canadians. And on behalf of the National Capital Branch of the CIC, I would like to thank you all once again for a most comprehensive and enlightening debate on foreign policy issues and what matters to Canadians. It has been a unique and informative opportunity to discuss the issues that matter to Canadians at a time where we look to resolve important matters related to our health, safety, security, and prosperity. I know that time is precious for all of you, and we very much appreciate the time and thoughtfulness you took today to answer these important questions. The information will be compiled to complete the Foreign Policy by Canadians review undertaken by the CIC in the fall of 2020 and presented as a document to the government and to all Canadians to determine those foreign policy issues that concern Canadians from coast to coast. This discussion has been most helpful and key to the CIC as we complete our work, and perhaps I may hold you to that thought of reconvening again at another time. Je voudrais remercier notre équipe de bénévolat, notamment Hamid Georgiani, Carolina Shimada, and Samuel Amoa and Christina Warren pour leur travail remarquable en réalisant le programme de ce soir. Et à vous les participants, to you our participants, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Je vous souhaite tous une soirée très agréable. Merci et au revoir.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Merci entre autres à notre traducteur.